Well, I think my big picture view tends to be that individuals, no matter how powerful, are only responsible for a quite small, quite small part of the story. This is a truly global problem that we're facing. And even the world's biggest emitter, China, is only responsible for about 28% of global emissions. The US is only responsible for about 15% of global emissions. I think the US has a responsibility to lead on climate more than that percentage because we are responsible historically for the lion's share of carbon produced in the history of humanity. But any individual, generally speaking, over just a few years, I think can't do all that much damage. The problem is that all of our trajectories are pointed so much in the wrong direction, and we need to quite dramatically change course very quickly, not just in the US, but really all around the world. Every single year, globally, we're setting new records for carbon emissions. I think the average person who's engaged in this issue tends to think that things are getting a bit better, but not fast enough. The truth is, we're still making them worse. 2018 was worse than 2017, was worse than 2016. And last year, at least in the US, we produced more emissions than the previous year because extreme heat meant that many more people wanted to use air conditioning. So we're already in a kind of a feedback loop where we're adapting to climate change by using more energy, which is making climate change worse. Donald Trump is obviously a climate criminal, a climate villain, as is the president of Brazil, as are a number of other leaders around the world who are not taking their responsibility towards their own citizens or future citizens seriously in the least. And yet, when I look around the world, I see many leaders who are seen as climate heroes, who are nevertheless presiding over incredibly destructive policies. In Canada, the legislature declared a climate emergency. The very next day, they approved a new oil pipeline. In Germany, Angela Merkel has been celebrated as a green energy hero because they've invested so dramatically in renewable energy, but actually because they retired their nuclear plants so quickly and didn't have renewable capacity to replace it, they had to turn to coal and gas, and so their emissions are going up too. There's basically no nation in the world that's behaving responsibly when it comes to climate change. And you mentioned the Paris Accords. There's not a single industrial nation in the world that's on track to meet its commitments under Paris. And the Paris pledges, if all of the nations in the world honored them, would only get us to about 3.2 degrees of warming, which would mean almost all of the things that I was talking about before would still come to pass. We would still be dealing with agricultural yields that were 30–40% smaller than they would be otherwise. Parts of the UK would be dealing with 30 times as much flooding. California would have maybe 25 times as much wildfire as they have now. All of these would happen even if every single nation in the world honored the Paris Accords, and not a single industrial nation is on track to honor them today. It's interesting you mentioned this sort of trade-off that comes up when talking about environmental regulation, about mining. It's a very similar one that's been used to argue against action on climate change, that if we take action quickly, it will be expensive. This has dominated the policy discourse around climate change for decades. And I think it's one major reason why so few nations around the world have taken action, because they understand, or have been made to understand, that movement on action, higher regulation, aggressive investment would be really damaging economically. And so many of the world's leaders are oriented almost exclusively around economic growth, that they wouldn't be willing to take that kind of measure. But just in the last few years, there's been a kind of major sea change in the way that leading economists in the world see this issue. It used to be the case that they did think that it would be too expensive to take action quickly. Now, in part because they're estimating the costs of inaction so much higher, and in part because they see business opportunities in the short term for rebuilding our energy infrastructure, rebuilding our transportation sector, our agriculture. They now think that almost 2-1, that faster action on climate will be better for us economically than slower action. So there was a major report in 2018 showing that the world could add $26 trillion to the global economy by just 2030 through rapid decarbonization. And that's one thing to talk about in the developing world where or the developed world where we have a lot of renewable capacity and the wealth to deploy it at scale. But the thing that has been most exciting to me over the last couple of years, even more exciting than the incredible protest movements that we're seeing around the world around climate, which I wouldn't have thought were possible a year ago, is that the government of Indonesia put forward a plan. This is a country, it's kind of a representative case study for a developing nation. Over the last 20 years, they've halved their poverty rate, they've doubled their per capita income. But like a lot of countries in the developing world, they've done so by doubling their emissions, by industrializing. But they say that they can halve their emissions by 2030, which would put them ahead of their commitments under Paris, and still grow at 6% per year, which is in fact faster than the 5% per year that they've grown over the last 2 decades when they doubled their income. So I think there's beginning to be a new economic conventional wisdom that can allow for fast action and make that trade-off that has so long dominated our discussion of policy around climate actually disappear. And we see that we can grow responsibly and quickly at the same time, rather than having to choose between responsible growth and fast growth. I think that's a major, major development.